Get away from him. Richard's voice cracked through the medical suite like a whip. I know what's in that bag. You're a janitor, not a doctor. Step back now. The fluid burns like almonds. It's not medicine. It never was. Jessica tightened her grip on the IV line, her knuckles white against the plastic. Security, grab her before she kills him. Two guards lunged gravel-rough hands closing around her arms. With one violent yank, she ripped the bag straight off the pole. Clear fluid exploded across the marble floor, spreading in a thin, hissing sheet. 20 specialists stood frozen mouths open, nobody breathing. Thomas lay paralyzed in the bed, eyes wide, watching the only person who ever truly saw him. Richard's face went pale, then red, then...
Wrong move. At Richard, expression, arrogantly panicked, thought a janitor wouldn't recognize a multi-million-dollar poison. Let's get into it.
Jessica pushed the mop bucket down the corridor. She kept her eyes low. Nobody in this wing ever looked at her twice. The medical suite swallowed sound the way money always did. Soft, padded, expensive. The floors gleamed white, polished to a blinding shine, and the fluorescent lights bounced off the marble in sharp, clean lines. Somewhere behind the glass partition, machines pulsed green, quiet, rhythmic, watching over the man who paid for all of it. She had worked here 11 months. In that time, not one doctor had asked her name. That was fine. Jessica preferred it that way. Invisible people saw things. Important things. Things the important people never noticed because important people only looked at other important people. Richard entered at exactly 9. He always did. Punctual, polished, and utterly sure of himself. His white coat had no wrinkles in it, not one, and his platinum watch caught the light when he checked it, which he did constantly as if time itself owed him something. He stepped over Jessica's mop without glancing down, without breaking stride, without a single word. She didn't mind. She had stopped minding months ago. What she did mind quietly was the bag. It hung from the IV pole beside Thomas's bed, sealed in gold foil, catching the light the same way Richard's watch did. Expensive things like to advertise themselves. The label called it a proprietary serum. A miracle compound, Richard told the nurses in a tone that made clear no one was permitted to ask further questions. Jessica wheeled her cart closer to dust the monitors. She didn't need to be told twice when it came to staying out of the way. That was when she caught the smell. Faint, bitter, metallic somehow underneath the bleach she used on everything else in this building. It didn't belong here. Hospitals smelled like antiseptic, like cleaning fluid, like her own gloved hands after a 12-hour shift. This was different. This had an edge to it, sharp and chemical, gone before she could place it. She glanced at Thomas. He lay motionless in the bed, eyes open, fixed on the ceiling. Locked-in syndrome, the chart said. Fully conscious, fully trapped. A man worth $500 million, and he couldn't lift a single finger to scratch his own face. Jessica had read his chart once by accident, left open on the counter. She hadn't meant to look. She looked anyway. His heart monitor spiked. She noticed it the way she noticed everything in this room, sideways without turning her head. The green line jumped sharp and sudden the moment Richard leaned over the bed to check the drip. It settled again once he stepped back. Strange. She filed it away the way she filed away most things, quietly, without comment, for later. Richard smiled down at his patient, warm, and practiced the kind of smile built for cameras and family members. "Right on schedule," he said. He adjusted the drip rate with 2 fingers, gentle, precise, and Thomas's eyes tracked the movement, wide and helpless and silent. Nobody else in the room seemed to find that strange. Nobody else was watching the way Jessica was watching. She finished the counters. She moved to the window where a tall fern sat in a brass planter, the kind of decorative touch that cost more than her monthly rent. Most of it was lush, green, glossy. But one side, the side nearest the IV pole, had gone brown and brittle, curling in on itself like something burned. She touched a dying leaf between 2 fingers. It crumbled. The pole dripped sometimes when the line was changed. A few drops landed near the planter's edge. She had noticed the dead leaves 3 weeks ago and assumed overwatering or bad light or nothing at all. Now she wasn't so sure. Plants didn't lie. Plants didn't have reasons to perform for an audience. She wheeled her cart to the next room without saying anything to anyone. She wasn't paid to ask questions, and she wasn't foolish enough to ask them out loud, not in a room full of men who had never once said her name. But she kept thinking about the smell, and the leaves, and the way Thomas's eyes had followed Richard's hands like a man watching his own execution. She had been there to mop the floors. Invisible people always saw the most. Thomas could feel the sheets against his legs. That was all he could feel, and some days it felt like everything. 5 years ago, he had been able to walk into a room and own it. Now he owned the room in name only, while his body lay folded into a hospital bed, locked behind eyes that worked and a mouth that didn't. Locked-in syndrome, the specialists called it in hushed clinical tones, as if a label could explain what it meant to be buried alive inside your own skin. He heard everything. He understood everything. He simply couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't so much as twitch a finger to tell the room he was still in here, still thinking, still screaming on the inside where no one could hear him. The ventilator hissed beside him, slow and mechanical, forcing air into lungs that no longer remembered how to breathe on their own. In, out, a rhythm that never changed, never paused, never once asked his permission. He had learned to hate that sound. The IV dripped above him, steady, unhurried, each drop sliding down through the chamber like it had all the time in the world. He watched it the way a prisoner watches the bars of his cell. He had nothing else to watch. His eyes were the only part of him still free, and even they grew tired some afternoons, heavy with a fatigue that had nothing to do with sleep. A bead of sweat slid down his temple. He couldn't wipe it away. He couldn't ask anyone to wipe it away either, not with words, not with a glance that anyone bothered to read. Richard visited twice a day, morning and evening, like clockwork, like a man keeping an appointment with a problem he intended to solve permanently. This morning he hadn't come alone. 2 men in expensive suits followed him in, carrying leather folios, speaking in low voices about trusts and transfers and effective dates. Thomas recognized one of them. An estate lawyer hired 3 years ago to handle minor matters, the kind of legal housekeeping that wealthy men paid other people to worry about. He hadn't hired the man to do this. Friday, Richard said. He kept his voice low, professional, the same voice he used to deliver test results to frightened families. Everything needs to be finalized by Friday. The transfer documents, the power of attorney, all of it. The lawyer nodded. He didn't look at the bed. Nobody looked at the bed, not really, not the way you look at a person who can still hear you. Thomas's mind screamed. His body said nothing. He tried the way he always tried to move something. A finger, an eyelid, anything that might tell the room he understood every word, that he was not a piece of furniture to be discussed over, that he was still a man with a name and a will and 500 million reasons to be afraid. Nothing moved. Nothing ever moved. Richard checked the drip. He adjusted it with the same 2 fingers he always used, gentle, precise, almost tender, if tenderness could be weaponized. The chamber ticked faster for a moment, then slowed again. Thomas's heart monitor spiked. He felt it happen before he saw the number, a tightening in his chest that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with whatever was sliding through that tube into his veins. Nobody commented on the spike. Nobody ever did. The cleaning woman came in some time after the lawyers left. Thomas had stopped expecting anyone to acknowledge her presence the same way the staff had stopped acknowledging his. She moved quietly, efficiently, dusting the monitor stands, wiping down surfaces nobody else bothered to touch. He had watched her for months now, the only person in this room who didn't perform for an audience, because there was no audience watching her either. She paused near his bedside, just for a moment. He felt her eyes on him, brief and searching, before she moved on to the next surface. He wanted to scream at her. Look closer, please. She rubbed her own throat absently, the way people do when a memory surfaces uninvited. Her expression shifted, distant, haunted, gone somewhere else entirely for a second or two. He had no way of knowing what she was remembering. He had no way of knowing anything about her at all. Not her name, not her story. Nothing beyond the careful, quiet way she moved through a room built to ignore her. She left without a word, the way she always did. The ventilator hissed on. The IV dripped on. The afternoon light shifted across the ceiling, slow and indifferent marking hours Thomas could no longer use for anything. He thought about Friday. He thought about the lawyer's folio full of documents he hadn't approved, transferring control of everything he had built into hands he no longer trusted. He thought about his daughter 3 states away, who believed her father was simply recovering, simply healing, simply waiting for a miracle that medicine hadn't yet found. He thought about Richard's voice, warm and reassuring in front of cameras, cold and clinical behind closed doors. And he thought, not for the first time, that somewhere in this sterile, silent prison someone needed to look closer. Needed to ask why a man's heart rate spiked every time his doctor adjusted a single tube. Needed to wonder why a cure that cost more than most houses had never once made him feel better. He screamed with everything he had left, which was nothing the world could hear. He only hoped in the narrowing space where hope still lived that somebody invisible might be listening anyway. The night shift was quiet in a different way than the day shift. Fewer footsteps, fewer voices, just the hum of machines keeping a paralyzed man alive while the rest of the wing slept through it. Jessica waited until 11 before she went back. She told herself it was nothing. A fern didn't mean anything. A smell didn't mean anything either, not enough to risk her job over. But she had thought about it all afternoon, the bitter edge underneath the bleach, the way it didn't belong, and by the time her shift ended, she knew she wasn't going home without checking. The suite sat in near darkness. Only the monitors glowed soft and green, casting long shadows across walls that looked nothing like they did under fluorescent light. Thomas lay still in the bed, eyes open, watching the ceiling the way he always did. She didn't speak to him. She never had, not really, beyond the small habitual courtesies she gave every patient. Tonight, though, something made her pause at the foot of his bed. He was watching her, really watching her the way no one in this building ever bothered to. She moved past him to the fern. The dead leaves had spread since she last checked, brittle and curling brown, creeping further up the stem each week. She crouched beside the planter and lifted one of the damaged leaves between 2 fingers. Up close in the dim light, she could see a faint residue along the edge where condensation had dripped from the IV line above. She brought it to her nose. The smell hit her instantly and her whole body went still. Burned almonds. Sharp, unmistakable, the kind of smell that lodged itself somewhere deep and didn't let go because she had smelled it once before decades ago in a factory that paid her too little to handle chemicals it never should have let her near. She remembered the leak. She remembered the evacuation siren. She remembered 3 co-workers who never walked the same again and 1 who didn't walk away at all. This was the same compound. She would have bet her life on it. Her hands started shaking before her mind caught up to why. This wasn't medicine. Medicine didn't smell like that. Medicine didn't kill ferns 1 leaf at a time, slowly, the way this had been doing for weeks, while Richard called it a miracle serum in front of cameras and grieving family members. She needed proof. She needed more than a dead leaf and a memory. She reached for her phone, meaning to photograph the IV bag, the label, anything that might matter later. That was when the flashlight hit her. "Stop right there." William's voice cut through the dark, low and commanding, the kind of voice trained to freeze people in place before they could think to run. The beam caught her directly in the face, and she raised a hand against the glare, blinking, her heart slamming against her ribs. "I was just," she started, hands where I can see them. He stepped closer, flashlight steady eyes narrowing as they moved from her face to her gray utility uniform, frayed at the cuffs, stained at the knees. Security didn't usually find janitors crouched beside potted plants at 11 at night. He clearly intended to find out why. "I wasn't stealing anything," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I was checking the plant. At 11 o'clock. It's dying." William studied her for a long moment. The flashlight didn't move, but his eyes did, flicking toward the IV pole, the gold foil bag, the sleeping patient who wasn't actually asleep at all. He had walked this hallway for 3 years. He knew every routine in this wing, every doctor's habit, every nurse's schedule, and he knew instinctively that something about this didn't fit any pattern he recognized. "You're trespassing," he said. "I should report this." "You should smell the spilled fluid by that planter," she said, "then decide." He didn't move at first. Then slowly he crouched, careful, methodical, the way a man trained to notice details notices them, and brought his face closer to the residue she had been examining moments before. His expression shifted, just slightly, a flicker of doubt where certainty had been. "That's not standard saline," he muttered. He didn't sound entirely convinced yet, but he didn't sound dismissive either, and that for Jessica felt like something close to a miracle. Footsteps echoed down the hallway, and Richard appeared at the doorway fully dressed, despite the hour, his expression sliding from confusion to something sharper, something colder the moment he registered who was crouched beside his patient's IV pole. "What is going on in here?" His voice carried none of its daytime warmth. "Found her near the equipment," William said. He stood slow, deliberate, his eyes never quite leaving Richard's face. "Says the plant's been dying. Says the fluid smells off." Richard's jaw tightened just barely, but William caught it. He had spent 3 years learning to catch things in this building, the small tells beneath practiced calm. Richard recovered quickly, smoothing his expression back into something professional, something reasonable. "She's a janitor," Richard said, like the word itself was an answer. "She doesn't know what medical compounds smell like." "Burned almonds," Jessica said quietly. "I know exactly what that smells like." Nobody spoke for a moment. The ventilator hissed on, indifferent to all of it, and Thomas's eyes moved between the three of them, wide, desperate, trying to communicate something none of them were positioned to receive. Richard recovered first. "Have her removed from the wing," he said. "I'll deal with this in the morning." William hesitated. It was brief, barely a beat, but Jessica saw it. So did Richard, whose eyes flicked toward his security guard with something that looked almost like warning. "Yes, sir," William finally said. He took Jessica's arm, not roughly but firmly enough to make clear the matter wasn't open for discussion. As they walked toward the door, she glanced back once at the fern, at the dying leaves, at the gold foil bag glinting under the monitor's glow. She had the truth sitting right there in front of her. A janitor's word, though, had never once outweighed a billionaire's doctor, and tonight looked unlikely to be the night that changed.
Wait, he's intentionally keeping a fully conscious man paralyzed just to steal $500 million. If that were me, I wouldn't have just ripped out the IV. I would have thrown the doctor out the window. Imagine being trapped inside your own body for 5 long years, while the man killing you smiles warmly at your family. The audacity is real.
The board meeting had been scheduled for 9. By the time it started, 20 of the world's top specialists had filled the suite, murmuring among themselves, waiting for Richard to present whatever miracle update justified pulling them away from their own practices for a morning. Jessica hadn't been invited. She came anyway. She had spent the night turning the smell over in her mind, the burned almonds, the dying fern, the way William's certainty had cracked for just a second before Richard's voice smoothed it back over. She had no proof beyond her own memory and a handful of brittle leaves. Memory wasn't evidence, not to men like these. She walked into the suite while Richard adjusted his platinum watch and addressed the room in low, confident tones about Thomas's stable progress. The lie sat so easily on his face that Jessica felt something cold settle in her chest, colder than fear, closer to fury. She crossed the room before anyone could stop her. 20 specialists turned at once. She felt every eye land on her, sharp and disbelieving, a janitor in bleach-stained scrubs walking straight toward the most expensive patient in the building. She didn't stop to explain herself. She didn't have time to. She reached the IV pole. She wrapped her fingers around the line. She pulled. The bag tore free with a violent snap. Fluid sprang across the marble in a wide, glistening arc, and the heart monitor shrieked in alarm so loud it seemed to physically shake the room. "Get away from him!" Richard's voice cracked through the chaos, stripped of its practiced calm, raw with something closer to panic than authority. He stepped forward, fists clenched, face flushed, dark with fury. Jessica didn't move. She locked eyes with him, steady, unblinking, refusing to give him the satisfaction of flinching. Two security guards lunged toward her. She didn't fight them, not exactly. She simply held her ground a moment longer, long enough to watch Thomas's eyes widen long enough to see something flicker across his face that looked almost like hope. "This fluid isn't medicine," she said loud enough for the room to hear. "It's poison. Synthetic neurotoxin. I've smelled it before." Laughter rippled through the specialist before she finished the sentence. Not loud laughter. Worse than that. The quiet, dismissive kind, the kind reserved for people who didn't belong in rooms like this one. "She's a janitor," one of them said, not even bothering to lower his voice. Richard seized the moment. "This woman attacked my patient," he announced, turning to face the board, his voice rebuilding itself into something righteous, something wounded. "She ripped a critical IV line directly from a man who cannot defend himself." He looked at William standing rigid near the door. "Arrest her. Attempted murder." William hesitated. Jessica saw it, the same flicker from the night before, his jaw tightening, his eyes flicking toward the spilled fluid spreading slowly across the floor. "Sir, I think we should—" "Now," Richard snapped. William moved slow and reluctant, his hand closing around Jessica's arm without the conviction his voice had carried the previous night. She didn't resist. She had nothing left to fight with, not against 20 specialists who had already decided what she was before she opened her mouth. Richard, meanwhile, stepped directly into the spilled fluid. His leather shoes ground across the marble, slow, deliberate, smearing the liquid into a meaningless stain no lab could ever properly sample. He looked directly at Jessica while he did it. He wanted her to see. She did see, and the sight settled into her chest like a stone, heavy and permanent. The evidence she needed was disappearing beneath the heel of a $4,000 shoe, and not one person in this room of brilliant, accomplished doctors seemed inclined to ask why a man so confident in his innocence felt the need to destroy it. The heart monitor's alarm cut off abruptly as a nurse silenced it, restoring the room to a tense, simmering quiet. Then something happened that nobody expected. Thomas's pinky finger twitched. Just once, just barely. A small, involuntary motion that nobody in the room was positioned to notice because every eye remained fixed on Jessica, on the chaos she had caused, on the scandal unfolding in real time, rather than on the man lying motionless in the bed at the center of it all. Jessica noticed, though. For one fraction of a second, just before William pulled her toward the door, she caught it, the smallest movement, the first. In 5 years, the toxin's flow finally interrupted long enough for something in Thomas's body to remember how to move. Hope, thin and fragile, flickered through her exhaustion. "You don't understand what you're protecting," she said to Richard as William guided her past him. "You don't understand what you're killing." Richard said nothing. He simply watched her go, his expression smoothing back into practiced calm the moment the door began to close, already rehearsing the version of this story he intended to tell the board once she was gone. The specialists murmured among themselves, already drafting their own versions, 2 versions where a deluded janitor had attacked a beloved doctor without cause, versions that would harden into accepted fact within the hour. Jessica walked out of the suite surrounded by 20 of the smartest men in the world. Every single one of them was wrong, and not one of them seemed remotely interested in finding out how wrong they actually were. The holding room smelled like old coffee and disinfectant, a combination Jessica had grown sourly familiar with over the past hour. She sat on a metal bench, wrists bound by handcuffs that bit cold against her skin, and stared at a wall that offered nothing back. She had lost. She understood that now, fully, in a way she hadn't allowed herself to understand it in the suite. Nobody believed her. Nobody was going to believe her. 20 specialists, a billionaire's reputation, and a doctor's spotless career stood between her and anyone who might listen, and she had nothing to put on her side of that scale except a memory and a dying fern she hadn't even managed to bring with her. The steel doors back in the medical suite slammed shut with a boom that she swore she could still feel in her chest, even from here, even through walls and hallways, and however many locked doors stood between her and Thomas now. She thought about him constantly. She thought about his eyes, wide and pleading, the only part of him that had ever managed to speak to her. And she wondered with a hollow, sinking dread what Richard intended to do now that the only witness against him had been removed so neatly from the equation. She didn't have to wonder long. Back in the suite, Richard moved with brisk, practiced efficiency, the kind reserved for men who had already decided how a problem would end. He prepared a syringe, the needle long, the liquid inside catching the light with a dull, silver glint. He called it a sedative. He told the remaining staff it was for comfort, something to settle Thomas's nerves after the trauma of the janitor's attack. Nobody questioned him. Nobody ever did. He approached the bed slowly, almost gently, his expression arranged into something that might have passed for compassion if you didn't know better. Thomas knew better. Thomas had always known better. He watched the needle the way a man watches an execution. He cannot stop his mind screaming behind eyes that refuse to close, refuse to look away, refuse to do anything except witness what was coming. Richard pressed an alcohol wipe to his arm, cold and stinging, a small clinical cruelty before the larger one. "This will help you rest," he murmured, and somewhere underneath the gentle words, Thomas heard the truth. Richard wasn't saying that rest meant something permanent this time, something final, something designed to close the only loose end his attorneys hadn't yet managed to tie off before Friday. Thomas tried to move. He tried with everything. His ruined body had left a desperate, useless effort that produced nothing the room could see. The needle hovered closer. Meanwhile, in the hallway outside, William walked slowly toward the security office, his mind still turning over everything that had happened that morning. He carried a small bundle in his closed fist, something Jessica had pressed into his hand just before the guards pulled her fully away. 3 brittle, blackened leaves she'd torn from the dying fern in one final desperate act before she lost her chance entirely. He hadn't thought much of it at the time. He had simply taken them distracted, his attention split between the chaos in the suite and the woman being dragged out of it. Now, alone in the quiet hallway, he opened his hand and looked down at them properly for the first time. He brought them closer. He breathed in. The smell hit him instantly, sharp and unmistakable. The same bitter almond scent Jessica had described the night before. The same scent he had caught for himself, crouched beside that planter, before Richard's voice talked him out of trusting his own instincts. He stopped walking. 3 years of training in this building had taught him to notice details other people overlooked, and every detail from the past 12 hours rearranged itself in his mind with sudden, terrible clarity. The spiking heart monitor, the dying fern, Richard's sweating defensive fury over a janitor who should have meant nothing to him, the leather shoes grinding evidence into a marble floor that didn't need grinding unless something needed destroying. He had escorted an innocent woman to a holding cell and left a guilty man alone with his victim. The narrator somewhere in the quiet architecture of the story might have paused here to ask why power so often crushed the people who saw the truth first. Why wealth so reliably bought silence even when the silence cost a life. The working class saw everything and were believed for none of it, not until the cost of disbelief became too large to hide any longer. William didn't have time for that question. He had a needle hovering over a dying man's arm and 3 burnt leaves closing around the only proof that mattered. He turned and he ran. Back in the suite, Richard's hand steadied over the syringe, his expression calm, triumphant, certain that within minutes, this entire inconvenience would resolve itself permanently. Thomas's eyes locked onto the needle one final time, his heart hammered uselessly inside a body that refused to fight back, refused to do anything except witness its own ending. As the steel doors had closed behind Jessica an hour earlier, Thomas had felt something close to certainty that it was over, that whatever invisible woman had seen the truth had run out of time to prove it. He held on to one thought as the needle pressed closer to his skin. She wasn't the type to leave without a trap of her own. William's boots hit the marble hard fast, his radio crackling against his hip as he sprinted down the corridor with the 3 burnt leaves still crushed in his fist. He didn't stop to call it in properly. He didn't have the seconds to spare. He reached the suite doors just as Richard's hand steadied over Thomas's exposed arm, the needle hovering close enough now that a single inch separated a dying man from whatever mercy Richard intended to call it. William kicked the door open. It slammed against the wall with a crack loud enough to make every nurse in the room flinch, loud enough to freeze Richard mid-motion, the syringe trembling slightly in his grip as he turned toward the sound. "Step away from him." William's voice carried none of the hesitation from the night before. He drew his weapon in one smooth motion, the metallic click of the safety disengaging, cutting through the room like a verdict already delivered. He aimed dead center at Richard's chest, his hand steady, his eyes colder than Jessica had ever seen them. Richard froze, then his face shifted fast, calculating, sliding through panic toward something that still tried pathetically to sound reasonable. "William, you don't understand what's happening here. This patient requires burned almonds," William said. "I know what that smell means now, so drop it." Richard's hand didn't move, not at first. His eyes flicked toward the door, toward the staff frozen in place behind him, searching for some ally, some exit, some version of this moment that didn't end with handcuffs. He found none. "Drop it," William repeated louder this time, and something in his tone left no further room for negotiation. The syringe slipped from Richard's fingers and clattered against the floor, rolling once before coming to a stop near the foot of the bed. Richard raised his hand slowly, his expression collapsing into something Jessica would have recognized instantly had she been there to see it, the particular terror of a man realizing all at once that every safeguard he had built around himself had just failed simultaneously. "Get him out of this room," William told the security guard hovering uselessly near the door. "And somebody bring Jessica back, now." It took 4 minutes for them to retrieve her from the holding cell. 4 minutes that felt considerably longer to everyone still standing in that suite. When she walked back through the doors, wrists finally free of the cuffs, she found Richard pressed against the wall by 2 guards, his gold medical tray lying shattered on the floor where he'd dropped it in his scramble, his pristine coat rumpled for the first time in 5 years of pristine appearances. He looked at her. He didn't say anything. There was nothing left for him to say that would change what William had already seen, already smelled, already understood. "You were right," William said to her. Quiet, steady, an admission that cost him something to make. About all of it, Jessica didn't answer immediately. She walked past him, past Richard, past the gathered staff, still frozen in stunned silence until she reached the bed where Thomas lay watching her with eyes that for the first time in 5 years seemed to be looking at someone who could actually see him back. She didn't know yet about the finger. She would find out soon enough. Outside in the distance, the first wail of police sirens rose into the night air, faint at first, then steadily louder, drawn by the panic button William had hit the moment he'd kicked the door open. Help was coming properly this time, the kind of help that came with handcuffs sized for billionaires instead of janitors. Richard's hands trembled where the guards held them. "This is a misunderstanding," he said, though even he seemed to recognize how hollow the words sounded, now stripped of the confidence that had carried them so easily just hours before. Nobody in the room bothered to respond. William kept his weapon raised until the first officers arrived, his eyes never leaving Richard's face, watching the last of that practiced composure crumble into something raw and unguarded and entirely too late. The monitors beside Thomas's bed beeped in their steady, familiar rhythm, but something underneath that rhythm had already begun to shift, subtle and slow. The first ripples of a body finally freed from whatever poison had been measured into it, drop by careful drop, for longer than anyone in this room had been willing to question. Jessica stood beside the bed, her bleach-stained hand resting near the rail, close enough that Thomas could see it without straining close enough that for the first time in 5 years somebody who saw him was standing exactly where he needed her to be. She had nothing left to prove. The room had finally caught up to a truth she had carried alone since the night she first smelled burned almonds rising from a dying fern nobody else had thought worth noticing. Richard had built his entire life on the assumption that nobody invisible would ever be believed. Tonight, that assumption had finally completely failed him. 3 days had passed since the night the sirens came. Richard sat in a federal holding cell, now stripped of the white coat that had once made him untouchable, stripped of the license that had let him move through hospitals like a king moving through his own court. The board that once laughed at Jessica's accusations had spent those 3 days scrambling to distance themselves from him entirely, releasing statements, canceling associations, pretending none of them had stood in that room while he ground evidence into the floor with his own shoes. None of that mattered to Jessica. She hadn't done any of this for statements. She stood now in the medical suite, the same room where this had all begun, watching morning light pour through the windows in a way it never had during Richard's nightmare reign of fluorescent glare and gold foil lies. The light looked different somehow. Warmer. Honest in a way sterile light never managed to be. Thomas's body had spent 3 days flushing the last of the toxin from his system, slow and steady, his strength returning in small increments that the specialists monitored with the same intensity they'd once reserved for protecting Richard's reputation. The neurotoxin had nearly finished its work on him. Instead, it had simply lost, outpaced by time and by the truth a janitor had refused to let die quietly. The remaining staff gathered near the bed that morning along with William, who stood a little straighter than usual, his earlier hesitation replaced now by something closer to quiet pride. He caught Jessica's eye across the room and gave her a small nod, the kind two people share when they both know exactly what it costs to get here. Then Thomas moved. He swung his legs over the edge of the bed, slow, deliberate, every motion, a small miracle his body had forgotten it still possessed. His bare feet touched the cold floor, unsteady, trembling, and for a moment it looked as though he might collapse entirely before he'd taken a single step. He didn't collapse. He planted one foot, then the other, gripping the bed rail with white-knuckled determination, and the room around him went utterly silent, 20 different kinds of disbelief settling over faces that had once dismissed the woman now watching from the corner. Thomas took his first step in 5 years. It was small. It was shaking. It was by any objective measure an unremarkable shuffle across 6 feet of hospital floor. Nobody in that room treated it as unremarkable. He didn't stop at the first step or the second. He kept moving slow and deliberate, his eyes fixed the entire time on the one person in the room who had never once looked away from him, not when he was invisible inside his own body, not when the rest of the world had decided he was simply a patient waiting politely to die. He reached her. He gripped her hands, bleach-stained and rough from years of work. Nobody had bothered to thank her for, and held them the way a drowning man holds the thing that finally pulled him to shore. "You saw me," he said. His voice came out rough, unused, cracking slightly on the second word. He hadn't spoken aloud in 5 years. He had chosen these words to be among his first. Nobody else did. You did. Jessica's eyes filled, and she didn't try to stop them. She had spent 5 years being the only person in this building nobody bothered to see, and she had spent 5 years assuming that invisibility was simply the price of doing her job quietly. She hadn't expected it to matter this much being seen back. "You don't need a medical degree," Thomas said, "to know when somebody's dying. You just need to look." Behind them, William cleared his throat, the closest thing to emotion he allowed himself in front of the remaining staff, and the specialists who had once laughed at Jessica's accusations now stood quietly, none of them quite able to meet her eyes. None of them needed to. She wasn't looking for their approval anymore. The morning light kept pouring through the windows, gold and warm, replacing 5 years of cold, fluorescent glare with something that finally felt like daylight should. Thomas stood on his own, shaky but upright, gripping the hands of the only person who had ever truly seen him. The room had changed completely. The invisible woman wasn't invisible anymore, and the silent prisoner wasn't silent either. And somewhere in the wreckage of Richard's collapsed empire, a single truth remained, standing taller than anything he had ever built, that seeing someone clearly had never required a title, a degree, or a platinum watch. It had only ever required paying attention. Fiction. But that feeling of absolute pure vindication when the arrogant elite finally fall, I live for those moments. Drop a comment below. What would you have done to Dr. Coleman if this hit you? Share it. Simple.